June 5, 1944. The English Channel churns beneath a sky the color of iron. Along the coast of Normandy, German sentries huddle in concrete bunkers, collars turned against the wind that carries the taste of salt and rain. Feldwebel Klaus Hartmann peers through the observation slit of his pillbox overlooking Omaha Beach, watching waves collapse against Czech hedgehogs and Belgian gates, obstacles his engineers have spent months embedding in the sand. The Atlantic Wall stretches before him, a monument of steel and concrete that Reichsmarschall Göring himself declared impregnable. Hartmann lights a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating eyes that have seen 3 years of war. He does not know that in 12 hours, those same eyes will witness something history has never before attempted. For 2 years, Germany's high command had prepared for this moment. After Dunkirk, after the fall of France, after the Luftwaffe turned British cities to rubble, the notion of an Allied invasion seemed almost theatrical, a desperate fantasy of beaten nations. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel walked these very beaches in the spring of 1944, ordering the placement of 6 million mines, 500,000 obstacles, and reinforcing the coastal fortifications that Hitler called Festung Europa, the fortress of Europe. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels assured the German people that any invasion force would be thrown back into the sea within hours, their bodies feeding the fish that swam beneath the English Channel. The Wehrmacht had constructed what they believed to be an unbreachable wall of fire and steel stretching from Norway to Spain, 650,000 tons of concrete, 15,000 strongpoints, and the conviction of men who had conquered a continent. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, German radar operators along the Normandy coast noticed something unusual. Ghost echoes filled their screens, thousands of them, fragmenting and multiplying like static. Some dismissed it as atmospheric interference. Others reported massive formations crossing the channel, but their warnings tangled in a bureaucratic web of doubt and disbelief. General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps, was celebrating his birthday that night. Most senior officers, including Rommel himself, had left their posts, convinced that the stormy weather made invasion impossible. The Kriegsmarine had assured them no fleet could sail in such conditions. They were wrong. At 16 hours, the first boots touched French soil, not on the beaches but from the sky. American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions tumbled through darkness, scattered by winds and anti-aircraft fire across the hedgerows of the Cotentin Peninsula. Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry hung from the church steeple in St. Miraglise, playing dead, while German soldiers fired into the night at falling shadows. These were the ghosts that would haunt the Atlantic Wall. 18,000 paratroopers and glider infantry dropped behind enemy lines to sever communications, seize bridges, and sow chaos in the hours before dawn. The Germans who first engaged these scattered Americans expected what they had always encountered: disorganized resistance, quick surrender, the inevitable retreat. They had broken the British at Dunkirk, the French in 6 weeks, the Russians at Kiev. But as the night wore on, something became apparent that shattered those expectations. These Americans did not break. Cut off, isolated in groups of 3 or 4, sometimes completely alone, they fought with a ferocity that bewildered veteran Wehrmacht units. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers of the 502nd Pier, separated from his unit, single-handedly assaulted and cleared 4 German barracks buildings at dawn, killing or capturing over 50 enemy soldiers. When reinforcements finally found him, he was sitting against a wall, rifle across his knees, asking simply for water. But the true mockery of German confidence began at 6:30 hours, when the naval bombardment commenced. The sound reached German positions like the footsteps of God, a rolling thunder that shook the earth before the shells arrived. 7 battleships, 18 cruisers, and 43 destroyers opened fire. The USS Texas alone hurled 250 14-inch shells at the cliffs of Point du Hoc. German artilleryman Werner Kortenhaus, positioned above Gold Beach, would later write, "We thought we knew what bombardment meant. We had been bombed by the RAF, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared us for this. The sound was continuous, not individual explosions, but one endless roar that seemed to come from the sky itself. The concrete walls of our bunker vibrated. Dust fell from the ceiling in sheets. Outside, the world was ending." Then they saw the fleet. Through the smoke and mist, emerging like a vision from apocalyptic scripture, 5,000 ships. Battleships, destroyers, cruisers, troop transports, landing craft, minesweepers, hospital ships, a floating city stretching to the horizon. Captain Wilhelm Ziegelmann of the 352nd Infantry Division stood frozen in his command post, telephone receiver slack in his hand, as reports flooded in from every observation post along the coast. "They're everywhere, thousands of ships. The sea is covered with them." Luftwaffe pilots, scrambling the few dozen fighters still operational in France, radioed back in voices edged with panic. "It's impossible to count them. Where did they come from? Where did they get all these ships?" The German High Command had predicted an invasion force of perhaps 50,000 men. A serious attempt, certainly, but containable, defeatable. They had calculated tonnage, estimated troop capacity, assessed British and American shipbuilding. Their intelligence was thorough. It was also catastrophically wrong. On the morning of June 6, 1944, 156,000 Allied troops assaulted Fortress Europe across 5 beaches spanning 50 miles. It was the largest amphibious invasion in human history, and it arrived with the industrial might of a continent that Germany had failed to comprehend. The landing craft doors dropped on Omaha Beach at 6:30, and German machine gunners of the 352nd Infantry Division, who had been told they faced defeated armies, opened fire on what seemed like an inexhaustible tide. Companies were cut to pieces in the first minutes. The 116th Infantry Regiment took 90% casualties in the first hour. Bodies floated in the surf. The water turned red. For a terrible moment, it seemed the German prediction would hold true. The Americans would be thrown back into the sea. But then something happened that no Wehrmacht officer had accounted for. They kept coming, wave after wave. When the first landing craft were destroyed, more appeared. When those were hit, more came behind them. When entire companies were shattered on the sand, fresh troops waded through the bodies to take their place. Sergeant Philip Strexick, pinned behind a beach obstacle with his squad, watched a 19-year-old private take 3 bullets crossing open ground to reach a wounded man. "He didn't hesitate," Strexick later recalled. "He just got up and ran. When he got hit, he crawled. They shot him again and he still crawled. He reached the wounded man, dragged him to cover, then went back for another. I'd never seen anything like it. None of us had." This was the thing Germany's military theorists had miscalculated. They understood logistics, strategy, weapons systems. They had studied American military performance in World War I and found it adequate but unremarkable. What they failed to grasp was that these soldiers came from a nation where even the poorest citizen had known freedoms unimaginable in the Reich. The freedom to speak, to dissent, to build a life of their own choosing. They fought not from fear of their officers or ideology drilled into them since childhood, but from a belief, however imperfectly realized in their own country, that freedom was worth dying for. German intelligence had documented American wealth and industry but dismissed American will. On Omaha Beach, that miscalculation was written in blood. By mid-morning, small groups had breached the seawall. Bangalore torpedoes blew gaps in barbed wire. Combat engineers working under machine gun fire cleared paths through minefields. Colonel George Taylor, moving among his paralyzed men on Easy Red Sector, shouted words that would echo through history. "There are only 2 kinds of people on this beach, those who are dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." It was not poetry, it was mathematics, a simple calculation that staying on the beach meant certain death, while advancing offered a chance, however slim, of survival. The breakthrough came in pieces. A lieutenant and 7 men found a gully. A sergeant led his squad through a gap in the wire. A lone private knocked out a machine gun nest with a grenade. Each small victory created space for the next. By noon, Rangers were scaling the cliffs at Point du Hoc, vertical rock faces that the Germans had declared unclimbable. These Rangers, equipped with rope ladders and grappling hooks, climbed while German soldiers above rolled grenades down on them. They reached the top, captured the position, and held it against counterattacks for 2 days, supplied only by what they carried in their packs. On Utah Beach, the story was different but equally devastating to German confidence. The 4th Infantry Division landed 2,000 yards south of their intended target, a mistake that proved fortuitous. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president, went ashore in the first wave despite being 56 years old and suffering from arthritis and a heart condition. Finding themselves in the wrong location, Roosevelt made the decision that defined the day. "We'll start the war from here." By nightfall, 21,000 men had come ashore at Utah with only 197 casualties, the lightest losses of any beach. They had punched 6 miles inland. But it was the scale, the sheer impossible abundance of men and material, that broke something fundamental in the German defensive psychology. Panzer Commander Hans von Luck, rushing his 21st Panzer Division toward the coast, found himself strafed repeatedly by Allied fighter-bombers that appeared out of nowhere, destroyed vehicles, and vanished before his anti-aircraft guns could respond. Where was the Luftwaffe? His men asked. The Luftwaffe was gone. On D-Day, the Allies flew 14,674 sorties. The Germans managed 319. The sky belonged to the enemy, and with it, any hope of reinforcement by daylight. In German command posts, the telephone reports came in like hammer blows. The British had taken Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. The Canadians were pushing inland. American paratroopers had seized St. Miraglais. Omaha Beach, after a morning of slaughter, was secured by mid-afternoon. Requests for panzer reinforcements went unanswered. Hitler, still sleeping at the Berghof, had forbidden their deployment without his personal authorization, and no aide dared wake him. The Atlantic Wall, 2 years in construction, had been breached in 12 hours. Feldwebel Hartmann, who watched the invasion from his bunker above Omaha, was captured on the afternoon of June 6. Years later, interviewed by American historians, he described the moment he knew the invasion could not be stopped. "It wasn't when the bombardment started. It wasn't when we saw the ships. It was later, maybe 10 o'clock, when we'd been fighting for hours and killed so many of them that the bodies were piled at the waterline. And then we saw more landing craft coming. Hundreds more. We had thrown everything at them, every bullet, every shell, and they just kept coming. That's when I understood we were not fighting an army. We were fighting a force of nature." By midnight on June 6, 1944, 156,000 Allied troops stood on French soil. The beachhead was fragile, costly, bought with the blood of 10,000 casualties, but it held. In the days that followed, the reinforcements came, not in the thousands, but in the hundreds of thousands. By June 12, 326,000 men, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies had been landed. The Germans threw their panzer divisions at the beachhead. The 12th SS Panzer, the Panzer Lehr Division, elements of the 21st Panzer. They were destroyed piecemeal by an enemy who owned the sky, who called down naval gunfire from battleships 10 miles offshore, who seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of artillery shells, fuel, and fresh troops. In Berlin, the mockery died. The propaganda that had promised swift annihilation of any invasion force went silent. German officers who had dismissed American soldiers as soft, undisciplined, and cowardly found themselves fighting an enemy who coordinated air, naval, and ground forces with a sophistication the Wehrmacht, for all its tactical brilliance, could not match. The Americans brought not just courage, courage was common enough in war, but systems, logistics, industrial capacity, and a terrifying abundance of everything needed to wage modern warfare. The symbolic object that haunted German accounts of Normandy was not a weapon or a flag, but something far more mundane, the American K-ration. German soldiers, subsisting on black bread and potato soup, discovered in captured American supply dumps a wealth that seemed obscene. Cigarettes, chocolate, canned meat, coffee, toilet paper, and rations packaged with can openers and matches. One German report to headquarters complained, "The enemy feeds his soldiers better than we feed our officers." This was not merely about food. It was about philosophy. America waged war with abundance because abundance was American, a nation that believed in enough for everyone, not Lebensraum carved from conquered territories. The invasion that Germany mocked became the invasion that could not be stopped. By August, Paris was liberated. By September, Allied forces stood on the German border. The Atlantic Wall, that monument to German engineering and military confidence, became a tomb for the illusions of invincibility. Rommel, injured in an air attack weeks after D-Day, would be forced to commit suicide in October after his name appeared in connection with the plot to assassinate Hitler. He never saw the final collapse, but he understood it. In a letter to his wife, written days before his death, he wrote simply, "It was over the moment they came ashore." 79 years have passed since 156,000 men stormed those beaches. The Atlantic Wall still stands in places, concrete bunkers slowly dissolving into the sand, rusted steel hedgehogs buried beneath generations of tide. On certain mornings, when the wind comes off the channel and the light hits the water at just the right angle, you can almost see them. The endless armada, the impossible fleet, the sons of factory workers and farmers who crossed an ocean to fight for people they'd never met, in a land most had never seen. They were told they couldn't do it. The Atlantic Wall was impregnable. The Germans were too strong, too experienced, too entrenched. And on June 6, 1944, they did it anyway. That is the nature of freedom. Not that it makes men invincible, but that it makes them willing. Willing to leave the landing craft when the door drops and bullets are already singing through the air. Willing to cross the beach when the sand is red and the bodies of your friends are floating in the surf. Willing to climb a cliff while grenades fall around you because somewhere at the top, tyranny has dug in and must be rooted out. The Germans mocked D-Day before it happened. They did not mock it after. Some things, once witnessed, require only silence and the long, hard work of understanding how badly you miscalculated the human heart's capacity for sacrifice in freedom's name.